I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings and problems to solve, days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, a podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, a board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Professor Doyin Atewologun, is the former Dean of the Rhodes Scholarship at the University of Oxford and is currently the founder and CEO of Delta, a specialist leadership and inclusion consultancy. She's the academic advisor to the UK government-backed Parker Review into Ethnic Diversity on FTSE 350 boards, an advisor to the board of the Tearfund, a trustee at the old fire station, and was previously reader and director of the Gender Leadership and Inclusion Centre at Cranfield. She's an honorary professor at the University of Exeter and honorary fellow at Trinity College, Oxford. Doyin, a huge welcome and thank you so much for being here.
It's a real pleasure, Ollie, a real pleasure.
I want to talk about your experience on the Parker Review, where when that was first released, it was a very different climate from the one that I think we're in today. Curious to hear your thoughts on what collectively did you get right and what could have been done better with the benefit of hindsight.
When I think about some of the things we've got right, some of the other things we've got right, the idea of having clear public targets, gave that strong sense of urgency, social pressure, good old social proof. So Robert Cialdini is a writer and scholar.
Influence, one of my favorite books.
Exactly. Right. Okay. If this other person who in many ways looks like me, sounds like me, is, facing the same market as me, other people are, if they're doing it, I should do it. I should probably do it. And so I think that idea of just kind of a little bit of social pressure is one thing that has contributed to the success of the Parker. I think the other thing I would say is, and this has come more from feedback from people over the years, which we were surprised at. The report, what we tend to do is we have the index, the census in terms of how the top, 250 companies, 350 companies, as well as the largest businesses in the UK, how they're doing in terms of ethnicity. But then we often have case studies and practical tips in the report. And, so one year I wrote a piece around, for example, race fluency and just kind of practical ways in which you can build your own race fluency. But we've had sections on, and for example, the power of sponsorship or kind of case studies in terms of kind of making sure that you are thinking about change sustainably. And a lot of people do really value those additional insights that come from it. So that's been great. I think maybe lastly, but this is maybe more a broad reflection, is us being very intentional about framing the problem as a strategic one. And, it's not a charitable, we don't tend to advocate it from a moral imperative. That's implicit, it's in there, but it's much more thinking about how the FTSE 350 and the largest 50 businesses contribute to British industry, and how within the UK we have expectations of our biggest contributors to the economy. And I think certainly following conversations I've had with various individuals in corporates, for example, there's that sense of, kind of pride and responsibility being part of it. And I think that's wonderful.
Certainly the introduction and We should probably actually have explained to those who are not familiar with a Parker Review what exactly it is. I'm sort of assuming not. Maybe do you want to just give a brief overview of what exactly the Parker Review was?
So the Parker Review, like I said, is a collaboration between the UK government, between business leaders, as well as academics to oversee a piece of work, and we've been doing this for over 10 years, that keeps track of the representation of minority ethnic individuals at the top of the largest businesses in the UK.
I thought it did a brilliant job in the introductory piece, which I'm sure you heavily involved with, making the case for why this is important. And it sort of laid out sort of three core reasons as I saw it. One, it's the right thing to do. Two, it leads to better performance. And three, it's required as a license to operate in society. I think we're seeing a lot of challenge against the performance argument that was put forward to support the case for diversity in the current environment. Past guest Alex Edmonds recently completed research into the impact of diversity on decision-making in the asset management space. And one of the conclusions he reached from that was that there was an impact from inclusion on performance, but not so much on demographic diversity. There was more from functional diversity, and hopefully I'm not misrepresenting Alex there. And reports that many refer to, like the McKinsey one, as the one which has been, I think, most sort of torn to shreds for its faux science. Really curious to hear how you think about this today in the current context.
Yeah, I do think McKinsey could have done a better job of educating people about how to best interpret statistics. And they, it's not something they've hidden from, like when you actually read the original report, there is a little line in there that refers to correlations not being causations. But I think, bearing in mind how often it's been, kind of cited, that there maybe is a kind of a little bit of a degree of responsibility for the firm to essentially say, yeah, no, there is a correlation. Let's work with each other to kind of figure out what some of the underlying reasons for these correlations might be. So, for example, when two things correlate, you don't know what direction. So we might have kind of a relationship between diversity such that it causes a relationship such that diversity causes performance, or it might be that high-performing businesses, because, for example, they've got like the right strategy, they've got the right leadership, they also have leadership that thinks about diversity and therefore have a diverse senior leadership team. So it's the high performance that's causing the diversity, so to speak. And I think there probably is a lot of more space for us to think about what the relationships might be. What could be the explanation of the gap of the space between diversity on one hand and performance on the other. And so Alex's work, for example, is starting to fill that in, because one way to look at it is that for some organizations, diversity leads to performance, but the route through that is inclusion. So therefore, where organizations have diversity but don't have a process that leverages that diversity, you get low performance. That therefore would explain a poor explanation of the relationship between diversity and performance, because some of those that are diverse have good inclusive practices and some of those that are diverse have poor inclusive practices. So therefore you have different outcomes. So inclusion, or effective inclusion processes explaining positive performance, makes total sense as an intervening variable between diversity and performance.
For those not familiar with DEI as a concept, can you just explain what it is? And particularly, one of the things that strikes me is a lot of experts seem to confuse the E part of that, and whether it's equity or equality. So I'd love it if you could just explain the difference between those two things and how you think boards should think about what they want to target.
Yes, I think it's so important for us to break down DEI. A few years ago, we were saying break down BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, because there was a greater understanding, particularly as we were in the throes and beyond George Floyd's death. There was a greater understanding that in the UK, for example, Black people's experiences are different from people from an Asian ethnic background. And so in the same way, I think it is so important for us to, quote unquote, break down DEI, because I think there is a lot of confusion, and when we think about the anti-DEI or, kind of anti-woke era in which we find ourselves in, I hear a lot of people who, exactly like I said, don't even understand what they are anti. And like, are you really sure you're anti that? So I'm very happy to spend a little time in terms of breaking this down. So diversity is essentially all of the ways in which humans are different, right? So for me, it's inevitable as a part of the human experience. It is just a fact. Like once you've got two people, right? Beyond one person, you've got two people. When you get two humans, you have diversity. Some of it is visible. Some of it is less visible. Some of it is based on experiences, background, culture, traditions, all of those things. But for me, it is a fact. It is like de facto. It is what we have. Now, one of the things about diversity that I just like to add is that to our detriment as humans, because we are quite simplistic, we have used visible diversity, as well as other types of difference, as a marker of attributes, as a shortcut of attributes. So, for example, people who we like or don't like, who are like us or not like us, people who should be in leadership or not in leadership, people who should smile or not smile, people who should serve or not serve. Right. So diversity in itself is inevitable. And what we've done as human beings is we've added meaning to some facets of it. Okay, I'm going to move on from that. Now, equality versus equity. So sometimes people spell out which E they're referring to and other times they don't. Equality used to be much more prevalent, so when people were talking about DEI 10 years ago, they usually meant equality. But I'd say in the last, again, kind of 3 or so years, the word equity has come up into conversations. One of the ways in which you can differentiate equality from equity is the treatment of people. So from an equality perspective, there is, generally speaking, an assumption that people have the same experience, that people are treated the same. So that might be, for example, we're going to do a test at, university exam, and it's 50 minutes and everybody gets 50 minutes. We make sure we're very accurate. So whether you do the exam on the Monday or a Friday, everybody gets 50 minutes. Right? So fairness is consistency. The equity approach says, well, because people are different, people respond in different ways, and some people may not work so well under time pressure, as an example. And so in order for us to ensure that people get the outcomes that meet their potential, we might need to treat people differently rather than treating them the same. So in this example, it might be making adjustments due to neurodivergence, might be making adjustments due to, kind of travel to your exam. For example, for some people, we're going to give them a little bit more time so that they can get the best out of this exam. So equality, treating people the same. Equity, you might need to treat people differently, bearing in mind their own individual experiences.
Is there a different line that you see people drawing the line on what equity means in a board environment? Because I guess, take it to the extreme. if I've got a tortoise and a hare in a running race, you could say, well, let's give the tortoise a head start. And if actually what I'm looking for is, I don't know, something where having a hard shell is sort of the most important factor, that kind of, you want to make sure the tortoise can get to the event so that they can demonstrate their hard shell. But if you just want a straight running race, I guess giving the tortoise a head start makes no sense. So it feels like there are maybe different scenarios where there's first of all, there's a cost to the equity that you're providing in certain circumstances. Is that cost so high that it outweighs potential benefit? But there's also, I guess, a ideological maybe sort of point of view of actually, doesn't matter, it's luck whether you're a tortoise or a hare. We should actually, on the day, let's make it even and let's see who wins relative to their, ability, if that makes sense. So just, can you unpack that a little bit more? Because that feels like a very complex idea captured in a sort of very simple word.
You are absolutely right, Ollie. It is complex. So there's a couple of things I want to build on, and I love the example of the hare and the tortoise. So if you run this race over and over and over again, right, you're going to get a bunch of hares, right? If that's what you do, if you're like, you know what, this is exactly the thing, this is a process, we're going to keep it the same, we're going to standardize it, and we're not going to make any adjustments, you're going to get a bunch of hares. And so the question to you, as a chair, as an organizational leader, is the bunch of hares, 5 hares, 10 hares, is that the best thing we need in order for us to do the thing that we need to do? Right. And you might be like, you know what? Sometimes a hard shell is helpful, but the hard shell people aren't coming in because, we only ... And so you decide, well, you know what, actually, that means we're going to be like time in this race for, a day rather than an hour. So we're going to need more resources, but we're going to need more resources. And we can justify that because the hares and the hard shells are important for the performance that we're looking for. As in, I think there is something about having these open, tough conversations in terms of thinking about what is the organization or institution or enterprise that you're stewarding? Like, what is your ultimate goal? And what are some of the things you need to think about in terms of, the adjustments you need to make in order for you to accomplish this goal? And I'm hopeful because I've been in conversations with senior leaders where just taking a little time to think about that, sometimes it's that classic short-term outcome versus kind of long-term results and sustainability, where people are like, yeah, this is a paradox we're familiar with. Well, you know what? Yeah, we're going to have to focus on the long term because of X, or focus on the short term because of Y.
So it feels like then there'll be some situations where equality is the right approach to take, and other times when equity is the right approach to take. And reflecting on that, it feels like what's important is to really think carefully that you're measuring or evaluating what matters when it comes to board hiring, and you're not just doing what you've always done, which will be embedded with certain assumptions on that you're looking for always, hares always, and actually you might not need hares.
My bias, and it's important for us all to be aware of our biases, is pretty much most scenarios in a complex setup like an organization needs more than a bunch of hares. And there's, people with hard shells outside who are just needing to be let in. I think, yes, if we're specifically thinking, hey, I need the fastest person to run this route. It's like linear, it's measurable, it's standardized, it's simplistic. Then yes, go ahead and hire a bunch of hares. I think the world in which we exist today is so multiplex that it is challenging for me to imagine a scenario where a board will come around and be like, yeah, we just need a bunch of hares.
where you're not going to have to cross a river, or where you're not going to get attacked by an eagle, where a hard shell or the ability to swim might come in handy.
Exactly.
Board conversations are evolving fast. AI, cyber, geopolitical risk, ESG. Without deliberate effort, even experienced board members can quietly fall behind. New Role Plus gives you personal expert guidance to keep your board value proposition sharp, your knowledge current, and your opportunities growing, so you don't wake up one day feeling out of your depth. Visit plus.newrole.com to learn more. So let's come back to that question that in an increasingly polarized world, what do you see as the path forward for boards thinking about DEI? You wrote this article, Should Boards Ditch DEI? Curious to hear how your thinking has evolved.
So I think the first thing to say is, jumping off the conversation we just had about that kind of like conflation of DEI, is even a need for clarity on the differences between the concepts, including what inclusion means. So, sometimes people are like, oh, actually, come and help us develop our inclusion strategy. But actually, what they're thinking is, we just want you to give us more, quote unquote, diversity. We just want more people who look different. That's not an inclusion strategy. So at the level of, from board level downwards, I think it's really important for us to be clear on what inclusion is. And inclusion is very much about making sure that you think about the difference that you have in two ways, because difference is inevitable. So if difference is inevitable, or diversity is inevitable, because that's the world we operate in, what are you doing with that? The two ways are, one, be clear on your shared and collective vision. How are we all part of the same goal, organization, collective values? And at the same time, how do I celebrate, acknowledge, recognize the difference you bring to the mix? So there's something about valuing uniqueness and sameness at the same time in order for you to get the outcome that you want. So inclusion is about the extent to which people feel they belong or recognized for their difference, such that they have optimal performance at the individual and the organizational level. And it's not easy. It's not straightforward. There's a paradox of being both the same and different, and leveraging that or harnessing that for ultimate performance. And so when an organization comes to me and says they want an inclusion strategy, that's where I start with. Like, we need to, if we're defining inclusion or inclusive leadership as that capacity to hold us as a community, as well as see our unique differences to optimize our performance, what would that look like? What would that look like at different levels? When you think about your processes, your culture, etc. So, for me, that's one key thing in terms of the ways in which, or key, idea or concept, I would like boards, chairs, but all, CEOs, other senior leadership team members to think about, like, what do they really mean when they throw out these words? And is it clear to them the work required for inclusion? Now, that is so important, just kind of pausing, having been in conversation with each other with regards to, all right, what do we mean when we say these terms? Because it is so easy in this world, in this time, to just kind of slip into knee-jerk reactions. Right? There is, in the last few years, like, with social media and, expectations for people to speak up or not speak up, sometimes there is that there is that sense of pressure externally or internally from your people that actually your people are waiting for you to say something. And I have advised some senior leadership teams to really think about the context and the parameters within which they choose to act or say. So rather than, oh gosh, there's a community in our organization and they're asking why we haven't said anything. Right, let's put some words together, a statement together. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I think that is, I'm saying before you do that, there is a moment to take a decision with regards to under what circumstances are we going to show up or speak out, externally or internally, such that when in 2 years' time or in 9 months' time, there is another socio-political event, you were clear on the parameters and you were experienced as consistent. Rather than, well, you showed up for them, you didn't show up for us. Or you haven't showed up for us, why are you showing up for them? I think I'd also have a number of other recommendations, and this is influenced by the piece that you've referred to, which is to continue to listen to your people. Because times change, contexts change. You and I are recording this, in the second half of 2025. So much has happened in the world more broadly, but also in Britain. But when you listen to people or when you're gathering perspectives from your people, I think it's important to think about qualitative and quantitative data. Because sometimes I think both data sources are key, because sometimes we can get pulled away into kind of stories of stories which can be quite powerful and compelling, and they're very important. But we also need to kind of balance that with, where is this coming from? What are the patterns? How does this fit? And I think it's really interesting. It's really important to think about data qualitatively and quantitatively to see how, for example, employees, customers, as well as local communities are faring. And I just want to add a couple more really brief points in terms of where I think boards should, as a collective, led by a chair, should think about providing that source of kind of steady leadership in the midst of this uncertainty, and knowing, for example, what your values are, knowing what those parameters are, like that sense of, this is who we are here, this is important, like reaffirming their commitments, their values, gives everyone, all the various members of the communities in your enterprise, that sense of reassurance. And one of the boards I'm affiliated with, the chair has such a beautiful way of reminding us consistently what we stand for. And she does it like instinctively, it doesn't feel inauthentic, but often when we're like, oh, we're not quite sure, then she would say, remember we decided, remember what we represent, remember what we stand for. And so if she's doing that with us, I'm hoping the CEO is hearing that and is duplicating that in different ways when they are working with the rest of the organization.
I'm guessing underpinning that is a whole load of documents where you spend time as a board saying, what do we stand for? What do we represent, etc.?
100%. Like clarity, consistency. So with this particular board I'm thinking about, there was a lot of work in terms of kind of versions of papers, versions of policies, versions of values that, went through the kind of the people committee in the organization, the ERGs, like a whole bunch of different stakeholders, as well as the board. Absolutely.
So I'm keen to ground us in some sort of practical insights, because I'm conscious we've been talking at quite an abstract level, but I think it's really important to have that context before getting into those practical insights. You've been exposed to a lot of good and bad practices on boards looking to improve their DEI performance. Can you pick out some examples of the best boards that board members listening to might find instructive and be able to take onto their own boards?
One of the groups I connect with, or I'm kind of involved in, does that I just love, is we have a warm-up session before our virtual meetings. and a closed down session after our meetings. What that means is there's a 15-minute, the doors open, the virtual room opens 15 minutes before we start and close 15 minutes after we finish. That is a great way to simulate some of the things that we're missing with without in-person meetings. So people kind of show up at a time that works. They bring their coffees. We check in. We just kind of have that really informal bonding process that helps that kind of enable that segue from whatever it is, whichever other meeting or priority, you are working on. And it really helps, I think, settle us in. And the chair who holds that space is excellent at tuning into the socials, because once we do that, once we warm up, then we are so much more effective in terms of speaking up, speaking out, challenging with respect. And what happens at the end, I stay on. Some people can't stay on, but when you stay on, then other beautiful things also happen where people just kind of add a few more, seek a little bit more clarity. The thing that I couldn't say in the middle of the main meeting, could you just check again that X has happened? And so there's a nice kind of wrapping up, or not wrapping up, but pulling loose threads together for those for whom it is important. So that is one micro practice that it's really easy and practical that I would strongly recommend. But the other thing that I want to add is, particularly when we think about induction or onboarding for people who are relatively new to a board or an advisory group, I think it's not unusual, for example, the chair to have a one-to-one. It's just kind of like, welcome to the board, welcome to this group, this is how we work, etc. I've only heard of this once. I haven't seen it, but I have heard of it, where you don't just do that one-off check-in, but there's like a 30-day check-in or a 90-day check-in. And even more powerfully, that check-in isn't just, how are you doing? That check-in is, what have been your observations? Is there anything you think we could do differently? Really legitimizing the opportunity, really legitimizing that space as a chance for added value, like a fresh perspective from someone who's new to the board.
So what about on the other side of it, where I guess you've seen boards getting it wrong, and I'm sure in most cases well-intentioned?
For some boards, it's so tempting to kind of look out and not look in. And one manifestation of this is, for example, thinking, okay, yes, inclusion or, equity is important for us, but the person that's going to fix it, or the folk that are going to fix it, are those folk over there. It's HR. So treating DEI as HR's problem or removed from your everyday practice, I think, is one of the things that I would love board members to do more of. So a lot of people kind of talk, right, what's the dashboard? What are the metrics? How are you going to hold your people to account, for example, if they're asking the CEO to, hold this work, or the chief people officer, for example. But I think when, I've seen, certainly in one of my past experiences, that when it feels like the board has delegated this work entirely, has delegated it out, that it sends a message to the SLT that it's not actually that important, because it's not, they're not embodying it. There's not everything you can embody when you're running an enterprise. You probably can't embody finances, and you maybe can't embody IT, but you can embody an inclusion strategy, right? And I've certainly been in conversation, just kind of heard throwaway comments with, from an SLT perspective, in terms of, that's not really what the board really wants, because this is what's really important to them. And once SLT doesn't take it seriously, then, there's the whole kind of ripple effect. The rest of the business is unlikely to.
And so for a board member, guarding against that scenario, what's the action they can take?
This goes back to the importance of a self-reflective board. So by that, I mean a board, a group of people who are coming together to make decisions or share perspectives on an enterprise, pausing and thinking about how they are coming together to make decisions and share perspectives on an enterprise. So there's a metacognition or self-reflective piece that I think that it would be wonderful for more boards to engage in. And so what does that mean in practice? It means, for example, using an executive session when the CEO or other kind of other members of the management team have gone out, to kind of pause and say, well, how are we doing on some of these values that, we espouse? Or how are we doing on role modeling these things that we expect the CEO to? In addition to, all right, let's make a decision. Let's kind of have a conversation about sensitive topics like salaries, like the salary of the CEO when they're out of the room. Being somewhat more self-reflective in terms of how they're operating as a unit. And I would tend to lay the responsibility for that at the chair's feet. Like that, there's a duality for me from a chair's perspective of thinking about, of course, the mechanics of governance. Like, are we doing the right things in terms of our formal responsibilities for this enterprise and this institution, right? Whatever that is, as we're thinking about executing strategy and supporting the CEO and challenging the CEO. But there is, in order for us to do that effectively, how are we showing up as individuals with each other? And how am I creating spaces to make that possible?
Doyin, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
I'm ready. Go for it.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Avon Ramwen no Maisi, which is a play about the last independent king of Benin before the British colonial conquest in the late 1800s. I recommend it because it is a book a ton of CEOs will not have come across. It's a short read and it's an excellent leadership case study. It also provides a perspective on history, on culture, on privilege, on power, a number of themes that are fully pertinent to how we operate today.
Most impactful question you've heard in the boardroom?
How soon will we be able to tell if this isn't working? It cuts through the optimism bias and makes it okay for us to check.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
That boards are there to provide answers or to give their seal of approval. I think that's a myth. They're really there primarily to ask discerning questions.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Performative listening, which is, right, okay, like someone says something and then you say, okay, and then you move on and there's no build. So I think we should, if we can, be generative or productive in our builds on what people have brought into the conversation. And that might be by asking a question like, all right, what does that mean for agenda item X, for example?
Most valuable board ritual?
It's the executive session, right? When CEO steps out and other members of the senior management team, and you pause and you think, how are we doing? How did that go?
Favorite quote?
My favorite quote, or one quote that I keep going back to, is actually my surname in Yoruba. My surname is Atewologun, and it means your hand is your inheritance. But one of the things that I take away from that is that you come with what you have. Your hand is your inheritance. It's what you have. And you leave with what you have. You leave with your inheritance. But it also gives me a message for me resilience, aspiration, ambition. So I have all I need with my hands, with myself, to succeed.
Most significant professional insight?
So I'll blend that with the worst professional advice I've received. And it was early in my academic career. And someone said to me, when I said I was going to do a PhD at Cranfield School of Management on intersectionality and leadership, and that person said, "You will not learn anything about intersectionality at Cranfield." And first of all, that was really bad advice to give someone who's at the beginning of their PhD after they've, settled with a university that's providing them funding. But what I found was Cranfield gave me such an opportunity to build, to learn, to draw, to contribute. So yes, there wasn't a body of experience or expertise on intersectionality while I was doing my PhD, but there was an openness to explore what it was. My supervisors were curious, were keen, connected me with other people outside Cranfield who were studying intersectionality, who were experts in it. And so even though there was that, I brought that quote unquote diversity because there was a different area of expertise. It was embraced and it was leveraged. And now so many others contribute to knowledge on management, on intersectionality at Cranfield. And I was pleased to have been one of the, pioneers of that.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
One of the things I've changed my mind on is the strength of the moral imperative of diversity and inclusion in businesses. My experience is that doesn't quite cut it for many people. One of the things I'm learning is the fact that when you do not leverage from inclusion, you are at a risk of loss and failure and missed opportunities. So there's a loss prevention issue that I think we need to be better at articulating, a loss aversion bias that humans respond more positively to than a moral imperative.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
So I used to be very comfortable in the observer role. Like, that's just my spirit. I'm endlessly curious. I'm fascinated by people. I can just sit and listen. But I learned early that, people brought you not primarily for your listening skills and your observant skills, but actually because they want you to contribute.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
I want listeners to think about impact. Everybody's all about impact, but remember, impact starts with I, right? So going back to the theme around, looking out and thinking about your stewardship and your responsibility and governance issues, right? What is your role at the micro in terms of the impact that you're making in contributing to effective group dynamics at board level? And then I want people to think about the impact at different levels. So impact trumps intention, right? We all have these big intentions. When we think about impact over intention, think about impact with regards to what are you thinking and bringing personally? How are you involving the group, the team? And what is the impact you're having at the organizational level? So breaking down impact to those 3 levels is really important. So at the end of each meeting or at the end of each quarter, you might want to think, how have I contributed, how have I developed myself to contribute positively? How have I contributed to the team dynamics, to the group dynamics? And what am I bringing at the level of organizational stewardship and change?
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
It's a real pleasure, Ollie. A real pleasure.
If you want to stay credible and valuable as boardroom expectations evolve, New Role Plus gives you expert support and access to more aspirational roles. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.newrole.com and use code ENTER at checkout.